All right, good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. Are we live here? Okay, outstanding. Welcome back. Good to see you all here and on Zoom. This morning, we have Dr. Tyra Fainstad, who's Associate Professor of Medicine in our division. She's also a resident site director for the Lowry Clinic. Dr. Fainstad went to College UC Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, the other Santa. Thank you. And then she did medical school here, residency at University of Washington, where she practiced for several years before coming to join us a couple years ago, which has been wonderful. Dr. Fainstad has a particular interest in addressing this critical problem in our profession of burnout. And she's done it through a pretty novel approach through physician coaching. And she's going to be telling us a bit more about that today. So Dr. Fainstad, thank you for joining us this morning.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I had already totally coached myself on the way here. I told my husband it's going to be me and Brandon in this room on a really chilly New Year's Day, or post New Year's Day Grand Rounds. So I thank those of you that are here very much. And whoever is on Zoom, I can't see you. If you have a question, I think we have somebody monitoring the chat, but it's not me, so bear with me. Hi, I'm Tyra Fainstad. I am also here representing my partner, Dr. Adrienne Mann. She's a hospitalist at the VA, and she and I run and created this program together. She was initially going to be here, but is very sick today, so is not. As Brandon mentioned, our mission is to basically positively affect the culture of medicine, and in particular, mitigate or prevent the problem of burnout that we're facing. And so far, we've done this by starting with addressing burnout and toxic beliefs and self-sabotaging behavior that kind of lead to this in training. And in particular, our niche is in residency and fellowship training, which I see as a really vulnerable and sensitive and unique time. I'll go into why quite a bit. So the outline of this talk is going to be, basically, I'm going to talk about where we've been, how did we get here, why is medicine so toxic, where are we today? We're all facing this problem of toxicity, but it's really hard, it's really complex and difficult to undo, and what I think or what I see as our path forward. So anytime we talk about the toxicity or burnout problem in our profession, I think it really comes down to a problem with the hierarchy. And I'm going to make some pretty bold statements, and I just want to be clear up front that I don't think there's any problem at its core of having a hierarchy. There's a ton of benefits of a hierarchy. It's necessary for patient safety. It's probably necessary for learning. However, our particular flavor of hierarchy is one that involves a power gap and what I'll go into as a value gap. So our hierarchy of physician training basically is this caste system that places the lowest learners on the bottom and the highest experts on the top, and everyone falls somewhere in between, sort of based on their rung of this level. Back in the day, like a century ago, or a couple of decades ago even, the hierarchy was maintained with a sort of secret culture or a hidden curriculum that involved belittling, some harassment, outright hazing. People talk about this a lot from a couple of generations ago, and how you had to sort of put your head down and get through training as if it was something that had to be done to you in order to strengthen you. Underneath these behaviors were these ideas of doctorhood being somewhat of a perfectionist culture and a real isolation, right? Dr. Shanafelt talks a lot about doctors being these deity figures back in the 1950s and 60s that could sort of in a superhuman way accomplish everything that's set in front of them. Humiliation, mistrust, burnout was all underlying these behaviors. In this type of hierarchy, your worth as a human depends on your status, on this medical team. And I think that's really important because it's a message that's given to our learners and to ourselves over and over again in some really sneaky ways. What we're seeing today is that this toxic hierarchy is not supporting our profession. So I'm going to go over a couple of GME, graduate medical education experiences that I have done in my informal needs assessment for this program. I talked to Dr. M, who's a retired anesthesiologist. She's in her 90s now, and she talked about being one of the only women in the field back in her training days. And she recounts, I worked all day and night. They called it residency for a reason because we lived there. I don't know why they call it residency if you go home every other night. This was back when I was a medical student, actually, that we had this conversation. She said, you kept your mouth shut, you put your head down and got through it. The hospital wasn't made for women doctors. We were lucky they even let us train. This is another example of actually a mentor of mine now. She said, my chief resident, she was thinking about her residency or her medical student training. My chief resident asked me how badly I wanted an A and pointed to a call room. I said, no, thank you, and I failed the rotation. There was no place to report that sort of thing. My skin had to thicken, right? There's countless stories like this in the baby boomers generation of training. And most of those people are still practicing today. Fast forward a generation, Gen X is typically thought to have done training in the sort of early 90s to very early 2000s. This is Dr. P, a surgeon, talking about a patient dying or patient deaths during training. He said there wasn't room for emotions during residency. They were these unruly things that got in the way of taking excellent care of patients, right? You had to be hazed into it. I can't tell you how many times I heard that word hazing when talking about medical training. My program openly compared itself to the military, wanting to break us down to build us up into a product they could put their stamp on. In this culture of the generations before us, there wasn't room for emotions, right? And resisting or ignoring emotions, I think, was actually an attractive option. The more interviews I did, the more I understood why actually not addressing emotions during training was maybe even beneficial. Back then, our field was even more homogenous. You know, in the 50s and 60s, it was a lot of white men with stay-at-home wives. Even fast forwarding to Generation X, physicians were willing and a little more able than we are today to sacrifice self-care and other priorities for their work. It didn't feel great, but it worked, right? Also, back then, many of the downstream effects were covered up and not talked about in a way that they are today. So while this probably wasn't super healthy and it probably didn't feel great, it worked. There wasn't room for emotions, and that was seen as something that was beneficial. So today, we've got these toxic roots. Not a whole lot has changed, although we are talking about this toxicity a little bit more. We're talking about the problems with our culture. So instead of outright hazing and belittling and embarrassment on rounds, there are these sort of upper level behaviors that we see. It comes in the form of microaggressions. There's a culture of blame and shame. Medical training is really founded on the idea of comparison, right? Compare and despair. Still, underneath these behaviors is an ideology of perfectionism. There's a lot of mistrust, trust no one, isolation, burnout. We're seeing a lot of imposter syndrome. And then the arrival fallacy, I think, is this idea that if you put your head down and get through it, it will be worth it and it will feel better afterwards. It's a fallacy. It doesn't actually feel better. This is something I coach on a lot. So here's a millennials experience. This is my generation. We were trainees somewhere in the 2005 to 2020 time period. This is Dr. T speaking on her first year after residency. She said, yeah, there's lip service around wellness, but then I get called sweetie by a patient after my senior shames me on rounds for not smiling. I'm tired. I'm a mom, a doctor, a woman, and a tired human. I'm tired of being told to lean in when no one will make room for me. This just sort of reflects that we're talking a lot about these problems, but not much has changed, except sort of the vocabulary. And still, there's not any emotional education. This is something that shocked me. When I finally got myself some emotional education or emotional agility, the ability to talk about and handle emotions, I was shocked that this wasn't a core foundation of my medical training. In a field that exposes us to some of the hardest parts of humanity, we have no tools with how to deal with that inside of our own bodies. There's also talk, but very limited attention to this culture problem, right? Trainees are still learning to equate their worth with their status on the team, period. It's a belief that I am having a lot of difficulties untangling as a trainee coach. There's not any formal training for emotional naming, processing, or agility. Self-compassion is really seen and talked about as a soft skill, and hard feelings continue to be resisted. There's a standard of being faultless and flawless, which leaves trainees with the feeling that they are constantly falling short, because of course none of us are faultless or flawless. So now Gen Z is here. Gen Z are trainees from 2020 to now. There are interns, and even some of our R2s are in Gen Z. This is one of the current residents here at CU who says only 1 in 5 say they're leaving the field in the next year. This was after that Atlantic article came out last year or the year before, I think. He said, I'll be surprised if 1 in 5 stay after another year of a pandemic where we get bullied by leadership, ignored by administration, and patronized by the public. Whew. They see it. Gen Z is a little different than the rest. I'll talk about that in a minute. So there's a lot of talk about burnout in our profession, especially now that the pandemic has hit. And there is a little bit of talk about burnout in GME. Most of the conversation is around sleep, not enough money, not enough time off, or wellness programs, including yoga, mindfulness, right? So there's been a ton of interventions trying to mitigate burnout. In fact, in this time period, in this graph that I'm showing you here, we've had an enormous work hour change. There used to not be an 80-hour work restriction for the residents, and that was thought to be sort of a cornerstone in resident wellness, is making sure that they only worked 80 hours a week, which we can talk about how outrageous that still is. But before that, it was 100 or 120. There's been a lot written about burnout, and still what we're seeing is that the burnout levels haven't really changed. This is true for faculty physicians also. So I take that to mean is it's not really about these things. These things are nice, but they're not fixing the core problem. When I talk about burnout with institutions or with programs, the main thing that I have heard when I listen to people's responses is honestly a battle. And it looks like this. You have the institution or the program or the system or society on one side looking at this burnout problem and thinking to themselves, that's kind of funny. You know, we didn't used to have this problem. Back when I was a trainee, there weren't people burning out. I wonder if our doctors just aren't as resilient as they used to be. You know, they're getting soft. Those Gen Zers, they can't handle it like we could before. I wonder if we need some resiliency training. Maybe we'll give them a coffee cart or a snack cart and fix this problem of burnout, which of course to the individual, the physician or the trainee, this is like condescending at best and quite offensive at worst. And they're saying, are you kidding me? Fix these huge problems. Get me an EMR that works. Stop focusing so much on productivity. Get me, resources and a team that can actually help me care for these patients that you're throwing more and more of my way. So then we stay on what I think is the top of this iceberg, battling it out over whose fault it is. Anytime we talk about whose fault it is and blame enters the equation, we lose sight of the real problem, which of course is no surprise to you now, that I think is the culture of medicine. This culture that we all are comprised of, the individuals and the institutions contribute to this culture. The culture of perfectionism, some martyrdom, overworking is idolized, right? And every single person who functions within this culture and knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or subconsciously promotes these ideations is a part of the problem. So what is culture anyways? This term has become really hot. I could show you a graph about publications in culture that it's just sort of skyrockets. The idea of a culture, a culture, I looked it up in the dictionary. The first thing that comes up is a culture for bacteria, and it's just this milieu that you're in. It's your nutrients, what you live and what you breathe. The idea of culture for humans, there's 4 definitions in the Webster dictionary. The first one says it's the customary beliefs, the social norms, right? To me, when I think about that in medicine, a big attribute of our culture is this expectation that we will achieve respect and fulfillment once you put in the time. That's that arrival fallacy that I talked about. And let's be clear, I'm talking about the negative sides of our culture. There are many, many positive sides of our culture, of our profession. But I think some of the attributes of our culture that lead to burnout are here, right? A culture is a set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institution or an organization. Think about most institutions or organizations that we function in, things like promotion, climbing the academic hierarchy, RVUs, and patient satisfaction are prioritized. And it can sometimes feel like our own values, goals, and our real mission are less prioritized. The set of values, conventions, or social practices associated with a particular field. Well, our conventions are really self-sacrifice. We're not taught about boundaries. Overworking is for sure glorified, and there's not room for emotions. The integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior that depends upon capacity for learning and transmitting knowledge through generations. Right? Worth is your status on the team. This is the dark side of our culture. Our culture has high demands. There's not much control over your environment. You may have been trained in an environment of bullying, outrageous work hours, and no emotional agility education, right? Patients first is a mantra. In primary care, where we often have patients that are under-resourced, we try and fill in that gap by spending hours of our personal time because our culture taught us patients first, us last. This culture has led to almost half of trainees developing depression by the end of training. This is in the millennial and Gen Z literature. We also, as many of you know, have the highest rate of suicide of any profession. The culture is not working for us, and it's coming to a breaking point. It's not working for our patients either. I think this is pathologized altruism. There's an ACGME core competency of professionalism that today still writes residents must demonstrate a responsiveness to patient needs that supersedes self-interest. This is on the milestones that we evaluate, that we grade and rank our residents on. How much they put themselves last. So how can we change? How can we maintain the parts of our culture that really have served us, our patients, and our profession well, but get rid of the stuff that doesn't? I'm going to name some practices that I personally think are important. These are not necessarily evidence-based. These are Tyra Fainstad's brain-based, and then I'll get into some evidence later. But I think there are 3 cornerstones that we can make a real change on in this toxic culture. We can start talking about setting boundaries with ourselves, with our patients, with our work. Yes, teaching more on limiting, not just agenda setting, which often is taught to us by asking, yes, and what else, and what else, and what else. But how do you actually limit the agenda? How do you get through a visit if we're forced to do this in 20 minutes, 30 minutes? Limiting time spent on answering my health connection messages. We talk about it a lot. Have them come in for a visit, but no one actually says, how do you do this? How do you do this and maintain a relationship with your patient? How do you do this and maintain love for yourself in this process? Rethinking patient reviews of doctors. Maybe it might be more savvy of an institution to hire a physician who shows that they can work sustainably, even if it means they have some negative patient reviews. Acknowledging that those reviews, those dissatisfied patients, especially if they're around visit length or response time, reflect flaws in our system, not necessarily flaws in the physician. And stop glorifying clinicians who spend countless hours with patients at the expense of themselves, right? These are things that we do. Encouraging clinicians to give less of themselves to work. Yes, I said it, less. Everyone gets real antsy when I start talking about this, but the way I see it, we are in no danger at all in our profession of ever becoming lazy, arrogant, incompetent, careless. It's just not going to happen. None of us are wired that way. Putting patients first should not ever mean putting ourselves last. This has gotten us into a deep problem. So this is where I'm going. I put it there just to show you my own North Star. It looks a lot different than other people's North Stars, but I think we can all agree that we have to do something to change these toxic roots. And it's got to start in training where we're very malleable. We're learning the lay of the land. What this looks like to me is taking a deep look at this hierarchy of self-worth and replacing it with an idea that you are worthy and valuable and enough just by being there, as much so as the person who is most expert on that team, right? So this is this radical belief that our first-year medical students carry as much human worth with them as most expert attending just by being there. It's taking a different lens and asking, what are they bringing to the team? What are they bringing to me? How is patient care and our profession better because they're there, not just because I'm here, not just because this very expert person is there. Every single person brings an equal amount of worth. It means teaching emotional agility, vulnerability, really working on the psychological safety of our atmosphere, and replacing this power that we wield currently with power with. Okay, so all of you know that I'm a physician coach. This is what this talk is mostly going to be about. I think that this is a way to take a step towards changing the culture. I don't believe that it is the way. I don't even believe it's necessarily the most powerful way. I think the jury is still out, but it is a very powerful way that I have found to start changing this culture with both institutions and with the people that are functioning in them. Coaching as a term is thrown around a ton. We talk about coaching a lot, especially in medical education. And when I hear it thrown around, I usually hear it in place of really good teaching. So I want to be clear, when I talk about coaching, I'm not talking about skills-based coaching. There's a time and a place for that. I do a whole lot of that in my education role, but that is not coaching on someone's brain. The type of coaching that I use and that I talk about and that most of these studies have used means looking together at someone's brain in an objective, neutral, and compassionate place and deciding on purpose if those thoughts benefit them or not. It's dissecting your brain with compassion and curiosity. Coaching has been proved to improve physician wellness in a whole bunch of domains. Dr. Derby here is the leader in a lot of this research, but there's been just in the last 5 years even a huge amount of literature around physician coaching. Most of the literature is around external non-physician coaching, doing one-on-one sessions with physicians. It's a lot different than what I'm proposing here, but it's sort of the same theory of looking at someone's brain together and figuring out if these thought patterns, beliefs, behaviors are helping you or not. The way that I came to coaching, this is a picture of the lake that I lived on in Seattle. I spent my early facultyhood in the University of Washington, and I lived in a houseboat with 2 small children. It was totally insane, and it was definitely a recipe for burnout and depression if there ever was one. It was also very beautiful and fun. Both and were taught to me here on this lake. I was just a classic medical trainee. I was an approval addict. I was very good at playing the medical game. I could honor a rotation by manipulating who I was, depending on who I thought everyone wanted me to be. And I did that pretty well, which meant I did well in training. But it was a rat race. I was like one of those ducks doing this underwater and looking okay on top. It kept going still. I had a whole lot of anxiety in residency. I didn't do well with sleep deprivation. I didn't do well at all with any critical feedback. I used it against myself. I had a real tough time incorporating it into my practice, so I usually just sort of set it aside and disregarded it and went on. That's how residency was for me. Then when I graduated and became an attending, most feedback left my world. We get a ton of feedback in medical school and in residency training. And then you become an attending and feedback stops, but also people watching you stops. People above you watching you stops. And I hadn't learned how to develop an internal compass at all. I didn't know how I was doing unless someone was telling me how I was doing. Someone who was better than me was telling me how I was doing. And so when that left for me in my early attendinghood without an internal compass, my brain's negativity bias only knew how to tell me that I was bad. I was worthless. I shouldn't be a doctor. This was too hard. Then in that milieu, I had a couple of kids who were terrible at giving me feedback that was based on anything. They happened to be colicky, and the floor just dropped out. I had no way to name or process an emotion. I had no skills except what I learned in doctor training, which was to put my head down and work harder, get online, look up an answer, go do all of these things, which the harder and harder I tried to do that with my kids, the worse things got. The harder I tried to be perfect and make sure that they were following their growth curve perfectly, the worse things got. My narrative was, oh, that's because I'm bad at this. I'm bad at being a mom. I might be bad at being a doctor. I'm bad at this. So things got really dark in Seattle for me. I scaled down at work. I scaled up at work for a while. I got a therapist. I got on a couple of SSRIs. Nothing was really working. Until one day, I had a friend from medical school reach out to me, and she was going through physician coaching certification, and she asked me if she could deliver a coaching session to me for some feedback. She needed hours. And I rolled my way into that conversation. I was at the University of Washington practicing evidence-based medicine, and life coaching is not a thing. I really viewed it on like the same wavelength as like homeopathy or something along those lines. But she was a really close friend of mine, and so I agreed to let her coach me. I didn't know what that meant. I thought she would sort of be a cheerleader and that I would kind of let her have it with how it didn't work at the end. And I kid you not, when I say that that one conversation was more powerful than I think any other conversation I've had in my life. In that one conversation, I learned three things. First, I learned how to name and process an emotion. Second, I learned that I didn't have to believe my thoughts just because I was thinking them. Just like, I didn't know that. I did not know that. And number three, I learned if I wanted to, I could actually be grateful about my negative emotions if I wanted to. I didn't have to hate my anxiety. I didn't have to resist it. I didn't even have to fix it. And if I was allowed to be grateful for it, something huge changed. I remember that conversation. I remember exactly where I was. So after that, I was kind of hooked. I invested in myself for the next couple of years. I hired a physician coach. I got my brain managed in so many ways, and I got my life back. I started enjoying medicine again. I have finally enjoyed being a mom. And the whole time I kept thinking to myself, how was this not taught to me in some way, in some small way in medical training? Looking around and having a ton of conversations with other doctors who were going through a similar thing, that thought grew until finally I couldn't not do this anymore. I decided to get certified with a goal of creating a program that could be delivered for trainees in medicine in order to just teach them how to name and process an emotion. I was in Seattle at the time. I was in a transition back here to Denver, and I landed here in Denver. I had gotten a grant to support this idea, and I met Adrienne Mann, who was living a parallel life here, went through an incredibly similar journey, and had gotten her own grant to do exactly the same thing. It's very eerie. Our grant applications read almost the same. We were in two different places. We have a mutual friend who said, hey, you two are both talking about the same weird idea. You should probably get together. So we did, and out of that, Better Together Physician Coaching was born. Better Together Physician Coaching started in 2020 as a coaching program for women residents here at CU. Our idea was to create a coaching program at that time in early 2020. The first conversation we had was actually before the pandemic, and we pictured maybe 10 or 20 residents getting together with Adrienne and I, who are now certified life coaches, and doing some group coaching in a room together, maybe once a month, some pre and post tests. We knew we wanted to do a group coaching program for residents because most of the coaching literature out there comes to a hard stop really because of accessibility of one-on-one coaching sessions. One-on-one sessions work, we know that they decrease burnout, but they take a lot of time and a lot of money from the coach's perspective, but also either the faculty or the trainee's perspective. It's heavy to coordinate ongoing one-on-one sessions from a scheduling perspective, and it's financially heavy, especially if you're using a non-faculty member who wasn't working for free like Adrian and I were. So what we decided to do instead of one-on-one coaching was group coaching. Like I said, we had this idea of 10 or 20 residents, probably internal medicine residents, going through this group coaching program, and we created this curriculum. As we were creating the curriculum, we realized the pandemic was starting to set in. We realized it was not going to be an in-person endeavor, and so we pivoted and made the whole thing digital. At that time, it was 6 months. We've now culled it down to 4 months of what we think is really good content. We deliver the content in webinars, just YouTube videos that we filmed on our phones. We made a workbook that is all online. It's fillable in PDF form if you want, or you can print it off. And it walks through this curriculum where we spend a whole lot of time setting the space, going over boundaries, ground rules, and then we introduce our coaching model, which is based on CBT or ACT, but with a little more sort of mindfulness. We also look at goals, values, purpose, sort of coaching 101 topics in month 1. In months 2 through 4, we really pulled out the sort of doctor in training or really doctor coaching stuff. So after a needs assessment, we came up, and now after 3 or 4 rounds of doing this, we've come up with these themes that come up over and over and over again. These are the things that we coach on the most frequently, so we made a curriculum that reflects that. Then running the coaching program, it's 4 months long, and once someone enrolls in the coaching program, they can access coaching in one of 3 ways. So there are regular weekly group coaching calls. Back in 2021, when we first ran this, it was Tuesday nights and Thursday nights. Either Adrian or I were coaching the residents on Zoom. There's anonymous written coaching. There's a forum where you can type in anonymously and post a coaching question on anything you like. And either Adrian or I reply back with some coaching question prompts. Everybody can read those. And then there's that self-guided coaching where we use worksheets and webinars to sort of go through the curriculum. So those are the ways that somebody can access coaching during this coaching program. The group coaching calls, as I said, are on Zoom. They're special because they're on a webinar format. So it's not a regular Zoom call where you can see everybody that's there. In a webinar format, the audience is completely anonymous. You don't know who's there. So if someone wants to remain anonymous, they can.